I was idling over the page of The Sunflower, and it suddenly appeared, the poem I'd read a lot of times before. I realized that the poem was talking about me. Ah, sunflower, weary of time, who countest the steps of the sun, seeking after that sweet golden clime, where the traveler's journey is done. Simultaneously, the auditory hallucination, the apparitional voice in the room, woke me further, because the voice was so completely tender and beautifully ancient, like the voice of the Ancient of Days. My first thought was, this was what I was born for. And second thought, never forget. Never forget, never renege, never deny. Ginsberg in conversation with Tom Clark, The Paris Review, Spring, 1966.
This was that famous summer of 1967. And I'd got married in the March of that year and were living in a single room just 200 or 300 yards up the road in Belsize Park. And we all felt at that time that film was the future, film was the life, and we should all be making movies, and those movies should go out into the streets and sort of should engage with the sort of social themes of the moment. To this end, a friend of mine from film school called Robert Klinkert said, I'm going to Cologne to pitch some ideas to WDR TV. And this was kind of a Euro moment when suddenly it seemed the doors were opening. And I suggested that the Congress of the Dialectics of Liberation, which was about to start at the Roundhouse, was really a crucial moment. And it was starting next week, so let's get it going. And I sent off this hypothetical script of about half a page and forgot all about it. And the phone rang and he said, yeah, they'll pay for it. We've got the money. We're going to start next Thursday. So suddenly I'm thrown into London to actually have to find Allen Ginsberg, R.D. Laing, all these luminaries of the moment, and get them to agree to film. And they did. It was as astonishing. The networking was so easy then. You went into Indica Bookshop and Barry Miles gave me Ginsberg's number, but he wouldn't give Paul McCartney's number, This was another thing, about 30 people were trying to get McCartney's number, because it felt like the rock stars and the existential psychiatrists and the politicians could all get together and thrash out a new culture. So that was the film, and we used Allen Ginsberg as the sort of needle to follow the story out. And it became also a story of this particular part of London, of Camden, Belsize Park, Hampstead, where they were all living in a circuit that probably reached as far as the richest people on Regent's Park, and the poorest ones like us in lots of these bed-sitters that were scattered up the hill. Allen Ginsberg at that time seemed like a kind of Old Testament prophet, like a kind of rock and roll figure. He was bearded, charismatic, he wore this red shirt that had been hand-painted by Paul McCartney. And he was a poet in the sort of Blakean sense, in the grand sense that poetry would change the world. And he was also an immaculate politician. He was superb at making contacts and mediating deals. So I think in the Roundhouse, the great moment arrives when he's sitting on this stage with Stokely Carmichael, who is doing a real Black Power rant. He is denouncing them as middle-class meddlers, as sort of masturbating with the culture, all these people. And they're all saying, yes, 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 we are. And there's Emmett Grogan there, who's a digger from San Francisco, and also a filmmaker, anarchist, died. And he's very knotted into himself and snarling. And between these two is Ginsberg, who's trying to say there has to be another way. I mean, this was his whole pitch, was like, if I put myself out between these various polarities, I can find a kind of mediated way in which we can all carry on and do something. And out of these movements grew the London counterculture and the anti-University of London. Really much more so than the famous Albert Hall readings of 1965, which was just a big poetry reading at the Albert Hall that proved that 2,000 people would take to the streets to listen to poetry. This was taking it up to the next level. This was actually a much more of a form of activism. What was striking me coming back into the Roundhouse building and its new steely architectural glamour is to remember it in July 1967, because what happened was that sort of tribes, as it were, camped out. As you came into this building, it was like going into some Siberian yurt, because they were sleeping in sleeping bags in little groups round, and there was a sort of smoke of dope was coming up, animated conversations. And David Cooper, the anti-psychiatrist who was running the whole event, remarks at the end of his introduction to the book about it, that what happened was that it all spilled back out into London and sort of infected the city, in that the discussion groups moved out into the pubs and the cafes. And I think that led into the spirit that became Camden Town in terms of compendium bookshop and the street markets that have all evolved from this one event. It became a kind of tidal wave of something that they hadn't even considered when they set it up. This is the part of London that was right for this sort of event, and for its time. I think the combination of that late mid-60s period, this part of London, in its relation to the old canal system, in its relation to the parks, and above all its relation to Primrose Hill, which was seen to be a sacred space. I mean, Ginsberg remembered that the diarist Crabbe Robinson said about William Blake, "You never saw the spiritual sun. I have. I saw him on Primrose Hill." It was this moment that Blake believed that the New Jerusalem was created around Primrose Hill. It's the kind of idea that's been picked up by Aidan Dunn, the poet, writing about King's Cross. Literally the new kind of golden city of the imagination would be forged in this sort of part of the town. And in a sense, the sort of dome of the Roundhouse was it, and it seemed to be it in a sort of deeply symbolic level for the kind of tribes of London. There was one morning we went off with the number of people who were involved in the film and did this walk that kind of moved through the cultural contours of London's history by visiting first Freud's ashes in Golders Green, coming down to Highgate and seeing Karl Marx's head, finding our way onto the river and then going east, and finally turning up in a place that seemed like another world, Victoria Park, which was then in Hackney, and coming out after that onto Mare Street and wandering through this landscape that was like nothing I knew, and realizing that, you know, in some subconscious way, this probably was the future, and if we wanted to live somewhere, we'd be moving east. And so this whole experience of this Camden, Hampstead part of the world was really just a sabbatical. It was like a magical few months of time in which some project would emerge, and what did emerge was the film and the book. This kind of filming we'd done with Ginsberg was frustrating, because it was, in a sense, you set up a camera, the man stands in front of the camera, like I'm doing now, but that is a kind of formal device that I wanted to go past, and so after this film we abandoned all that and started shooting on 8mm film, much more free and easy, in a brackagey sense, like kind of diary films in which you would have the film with you like a notebook all the time, not just between 10 and 10:15 when you stand in front of a camera in an arranged space with proper security and everything paid for. So there was no sound, but there was then 10, 12 years of just a life, and the camera passing around between numerous people. And so that kind of documentation was what it led to, but I wouldn't have known it without trying to do it the other way. The whole filming thing was a big lesson, because I was about 23 years old, thrown in the deep end. Obviously I had to find all these people, and there's no proper script as such. The actual danger of exposing a piece of emulsion, getting light onto it, was was a risk. You know, there was more drama, that it could all go horribly wrong, as it did for us. Robert Klinkert shot the first 3-4 days, in which included a whole day spent with Ginsberg at the house in Regent's Park, a whole session in the park discussing poetry, another session on top of Primrose Hill, a long conversation with R.D. Laing in the back of the roundhouse here in these sort of railway yards. And we went down to call the labs from a phone booth, and I could see Robert's face turning grey in the phone booth. And what it was that the first 5,000 feet of film were all completely black and had been shot with a lock shut. So there was a kind of moment of complete panic and horror, and then decisions as to what you would do, and I had to go back and find some of the people again, and Ginsberg had agreed to come back and do another day, but the second day he was much more depressed and low-spirited because his long-term companion Peter Orlovsky had freaked out in New York and broken all the windows in this building and had been taken into Bellevue Mental Hospital. So all that was going on, and he still managed to talk and come up with this sort of Burroughs-like vision of the end of the world, which I thought was very impressive. And then we actually went round to R.D. Laing's house, which was just up in Belsize Park.
Laing's old house.
And in the first interview with Laing, he'd been saying, I've discovered you don't have to consume anymore. You don't need carpets, you don't need chairs, you don't need any of this stuff. All I've got is a fridge. And so I thought, oh yes, so let's have a look when we go around your house. And it was true, there was just nothing in this house. We sat on the floor on bare boards. There was a record player going in the corner, and there was a big fridge, and that was it. Otherwise he had nothing. And the garden was just like a wilderness of neck-high weeds, and he wandered there, and then he sat and talked. And it was that moment when it seemed that you could throw open the doors of the madhouses, and that madness was a vision, and it was the up moment, and then it crashed sort of immediately the following year. All of this fragmented, and afterwards became a much tougher way of life. But the lesson I learned was that the form I used in this first book by accident, which was a diary form of short sort of Polaroid-like portraits of my own life, transcripts of long tapes, photographs, documentary evidence that would appear randomly, like found footage, letters, telegrams, put in the whole lot. And that kind of gives you a structure in a book, and I'm still using exactly the same techniques 40 years later. And doing the film was a way of finding out this isn't how you work. But on the other hand, it proved to me that one of the things you need to do is to find people and talk to them, and that they're very happy to talk to you. A kid from the street could be suddenly talking to some of the most famous poets in the world, and they would talk to you on equal terms, which I think now would be very difficult to do. And maybe that's what's most important about Ginsberg in the end, is that he moved so much and was so readily available and so generous with his time.
There was this very real sense that something was changing. It was certainly changing the participants, myself, but also a sense that one could be involved in that change. So there was this sort of feeling, in some way, that revolution was in the air. There are a whole number of sort of facets to it. I mean, music was enormously important. The idea that the Beatles changed the world I think there's a genuine thesis lurking there. There were all sorts of extraordinary things happening politically. We'd just come out of the sort of era of ban the bomb marches and that sort of thing, sort of huge political demonstrations, but you don't seem to have that energy quite to the same extent in this particular era. Art, happenings, all sorts of extraordinary occasions, people smearing themselves with offal and blood in sort of basements, jazz, poetry, a whole set of extraordinary convergences, all in some way, I think, underpinned by this sense of sort of disaffiliation, disaffection, And yet, simultaneously, there was this sort of convergence of people coming together with a whole host of shared enthusiasms and understandings. And maybe there was a potential convergence also with Ginsberg and that whole sort of beat imperative. And somewhere lurking very much in the midst of this, a genuine sort of icon of that age, I think, was Ronnie Lang. One of the things that I think has got lost in the sort of passage of time is really just how dreadful NHS psychiatry was at the back end of the 1950s, where lobotomies, leucotomies, ECT, insulin-induced coma therapies, straitjackets, locked wards. This was the order of the day. This was the psychiatry that Lang, as a very young doctor in Glasgow, entered into. And I think he was very influenced by a whole number of people, but I think Artaud, and Artaud's idea that the lunatic is the one who society refuses to listen to because what they have to say is unbearable, was something that Lang was very, very informed by. Before the advent of all sorts of pharmacological input into the field of psychiatry, by and large what was going on, that people were just sort of given a place of asylum and left to get on with it. And he said that what you would see is that by and large, about 30% of the people would, after a period of time, they'd engage in a spontaneous recovery by doing nothing. 30% of the people would probably be sort of in and out of psychotic episodes for much of their life. The other 30% were pretty much sort of, in inverted commas, impossible, and would live a life of incarceration from there on in. But he thought that, well, if it's a 1 in 3 chance, he reckons that's a better bet if you do nothing than if you bombard these people with drugs. And basically, I would say that was the core of the anti-psychiatry movement. He wrote The Divided Self, which came out in 1960, and this blew big. This made him a celebrity within the chattering classes. And it's an extraordinary thing because actually it's a very, very difficult book to read. It's not a light read. This is not Jilly Cooper. This is heavy Husserlian, Heideggerian phenomenology, interwoven with a whole set of psychoanalytical understandings about the nature of schizophrenia and psychosis. And yet it became enormously popular. It was, Ronnie Lang was like sort of top of the pops. It seemed to speak to a moment of the times, this notion that in some way, and he then became a spokesperson for that in some way it was through madness that we could disrupt these alienating vistas of normalcy. Madness as therapeutic, madness as on the side of liberation, madness as in some way disrupting some otherwise sort of insistent, alienating structure of normality. One of the stories that I think I always found enormously amusing about Ronnie Lang was that at his time at the Tavistock, he did all this research about making comparative studies of so-called normal families and families of those people who had had a member of the family diagnosed as schizophrenic. And of course, one of the things that he found, which buttressed his particular thesis, that the greatest alienation that we're all subject to is that we call normality, was that normal families were as weird as fuck. And he would ask them, these were sort of families up in Edgware, Mill Hill, where do you think the centre of London is? And he said, almost invariably, they would say Buckingham Palace. So he said, as a psychoanalyst, he thought the prevailing normal fantasy was that the centre of the universe was the Queen's cunt. Much of the 60s, of course, was marinated in drugs. At the legalised dope rally, there, of course, was Allen Ginsberg with his little Tibetan bell, and basically very, very central in those initiatives. The next morning, I was heading across the channel on the road to Kathmandu basically to get the hell out of London, and to get the hell out of very difficult and increasingly converging drug experiences that many people were entangled with. There was a need to get out of town. On my return, the Anti-University of London set off in Hoxton, before Hoxton was Hoxton, in Rivington Street. I went along to the David Cooper group, and then that dispersed into various people's flats all over North and West London. I think the very last David Cooper group took place in the Manor Vegetarian Restaurant, Chalk Farm, which is probably, a cricket's ball's throw from the Roundhouse, where there was a sort of gathering of that small little subculture met there before David basically headed off then to Buenos Aires. He had to get out of town because he was basically cracking up, and he thought Buenos Aires was the place where the best psychoanalysis in the world resided, so he disappeared off there. An element of the spiritual entered into it, and sort of Lang went off on a spiritual voyage, almost quite antithetical. You were saying about this sort of continuum of possibility that was there at the Dialectics of Liberation. Lang at one end, sort of serious. Now he's heading off, not quite the Maharishi, but it's that sort of trip, India, spiritual life. Over here, David Cooper, if not going through his own sort of personal crisis, still very much running with the baton of a political revolution. But of course this dispersed, but there were all sorts of, like the Anti-University of London itself, small-scale initiatives where that energy continued, and I think continued for a considerable period of time. All of this is through the sort of prism of nostalgia and sort of faulty memory, but certainly the experience of the 60s, and say around about that time of the Dialectics of Liberation, that you could do all of this on a shoestring. There wasn't a money culture, there wasn't a sense that value was so handcuffed to money, which I think now is absolutely ubiquitous, but it seemed far more intimate.
I don't know what it was like when you were watching the psychedelic light shows, but all the events that were here were completely kind of ad hoc. It felt like it was still a railway shed, and a couple of people had come in and put out chairs like for a church hall meeting.
There was lots of that going on, certainly, but there were also, of course, I mean, this was one of the major rock venues, and I think it was here. I was certainly here the night that Jim Morrison and the Doors and the Jefferson Airplane were playing here, and then when the mob was sort of halfway down to Primrose Hill. There was such queues trying to get in, and I think that was one of the nights. There were maybe many where Jim Morrison got his cock out and started to sort of fondle it around in front of the audience at about 3 a.m. in the morning.
It's obviously impossible to overstate the cultural importance of this period. I mean, both in terms of what it has in ways, and I think in terms of our Sunflower and Kodak Mantra Diaries and that kind of work, I think the importance is really twofold. I mean, crucially, what we have here is a document from the times, a finished, shaped piece of work, but it's not just an archive clip after the event with all the revisionist intentions of later decades, good or bad. So in that sense, it's crucial, but I think also it fits very, very well into a larger filmic climate where form and content, technique and thematic approach all come together in a way that I guess was sort of presaged in the early 60s in a more fictional sense by Jean-Luc Godard, where 4 or 5 films a year were coming out from his extraordinary imagination, clearly a central view for everyone at the time and for those of us who were interested after the event. But then on the back of that constant reinvention of cinematic form, you have this emergent verite movement of D.A. Pennebaker, Robert Frank, Conrad Rooks, this idea of the camera in the moment, creating the action as much as just merely observing it. And that sense of involvement, of participation, both in front of and behind the lens, that breaking down of those boundaries is so crucial. And coming out of this period when, again, everything about participation was central to how the involvement of ideas and people merged, it echoes echoes forward, if you like, to the digital age, where again those boundaries are breaking down. But the sense of how ideas carry without any of that technical support now that the internet offers, how they carry through the sheer force of personality, through the sense of community networks and cultural networks, is the great lesson for me of that time, and the great inspiration, really. There is this huge East End gallery movement now where new spaces are opening up theoretically all the time. But I think the sense of commodification of space now is what mediates against the spontaneous activity, obviously, of the mid to late 60s. And I think now there's a sense, perhaps, that the internet becomes that regular space, if you like, where there is no boundary, there is no fee to be paid, there is no right to be sought. You can just go and put your work out into the internet. And of course that's a very different kind of space. It doesn't allow for that browsing in the same way. It doesn't allow for that personal encounter, that shift of meeting and the new direction that can come from that. There is a crucial sense of the threat to place, not just in the disappearance of existing in historical space, but the threat of place itself, almost the idea of place, I think, in this digital realm, and obviously endlessly commercialized realm. And so the moving image, I guess, catches that. It tries to find whatever way it can, whether it's in installation form, whether it's in single screen form, whether it's a handheld, whether it's even on mobile phones, to infiltrate itself into the public realm. People like Ginsberg, R.D. Laing, obviously Emmett Grogan, Stokely Carmichael, all these iconic 60s figures have something to teach us now, clearly. And again, primarily perhaps, it's this idea that as an individual, you can make a difference. As a small press publisher, you can make a difference. As long as you make work, as long as you keep making images, writing texts, putting work out there, making those social connections, then you have no idea what the impact of your work can be. All you do know is if you don't make any work, and you don't speak, and you don't write, then nothing will happen. And I think the great legacy for me of this period, whether it's in the underground press, whether it's in the underground filmmaking, in the social and cultural networks that were created at this time, is that you just have to keep going. You have to find ways through. The new technologies allow that, in some ways make it easier to do certain things, but without that personal and social network behind it, I think, then the work exists in isolation. But crucially, you must keep making the work.
This view here was the heart of the film, because we'd been doing all the discussions down there in the house in Regent's Terrace, and it was a bit enclosed, and then suddenly you come up here and there's a sense of a different kind of London, not just the privileged spaces of this very rich house owned by an American exile, but there's a great sweep, and seeing this totally American poet, the American beat poet Allen Ginsberg, who everybody associates with San Francisco and New York, seeing him in a London landscape was to see a different kind of person. He was a huge fan of William Blake, and he says what turned him on to poetry originally was when he was in New York all by himself. All his friends like Kerouac and Neil Cassidy were disappeared, and it was a very hot summer, and he heard the voice of William Blake reading, this prophetic, grave voice, reading the poem Our Sunflower, and that was it. That was what made him a poet. So coming back here to the place where Blake saw the spiritual sun, and seeing this made Ginsberg feel something more than an American beat poet, but made him an international figure in the prophetic tradition of the English poets like William Blake. Because before this, the reason that he came up here was that he's been in a party in the house down there, and everybody was sleeping in the early morning, and he came up here by himself and lay down on the grass, and then heard the sound of a bell from that church down below, and he wrote a little poem, about 4 or 5 lines, about finishing up with "It's the sound of a bell." And Robert Klinkert and Ginsberg sat down here, and it took about 10 shots to do it, because Klinkert wanted to pan across and hit the church just at the moment of the line that said "It's the sound of a bell," and of course it never it never really worked. And even in the final version in the film, you can see that it's sort of fudged with an extra zoom from closer by. It's like 1 millisecond in time to be back up here.